You think you've seen every young midfielder story 1,000 times, academy kid, a couple of flashy minutes, a viral clip, then vanishing into rotation. Kobbie Mainoo's arc refuses that template. He is not a highlight reel wunderkind, and he's not a boxed, predictable prodigy either. He feels like a slow burn argument in favor of something we keep forgetting. The modern midfield's quiet revolutions are built out of small decisions, not viral moments. Watch him closely, and you won't just see a talented teenager. You'll see a function, an on-field problem solver whose value is measured in how he changes other people's decisions, not in how many times he leaps into a camera frame. There are headlines that anchor his credibility. He earned his first senior England call-up in March 2024, a moment that translated whispers into something official and seismic for a player who'd only recently started making senior minutes at Manchester United. That call-up didn't arrive because he scored a spectacular volley on a Tuesday. It arrived because the sum of his minutes, his calmness under pressure, and that odd ability to make structure out of chaos finally convinced selectors he belonged in the national conversation. That kind of validation matters for a teenager, not as a stamp of finished quality, but as a credit line for future trust. If you want the big cultural moment we all remember, there's the FA Cup final memory, a derby, a stage, and a goal that snapped into the quiet history of Old Trafford.
Manchester United with Bruno Fernandes miskicked it. Mainoo! No flag this time. United 2 goals to the good.
It was a simple thing, the kind of finish that reads better live than described, but the optics won the room. An academy kid in the biggest domestic final with the moment of composure that used to be a generational proof. Those moments are rare, and they compactly shift attention. For Mainoo, it did exactly that. It turned a promising academy CV into a real narrative thread people felt comfortable following. But this story matters less for the trophy snapshots and more for the texture between them. Mainoo's real signature is subtle. He reads pressure and he repurposes it. He doesn't outrun the game so much as outthink the seconds you plan for. In a league obsessed with explosive tools, his weapon is timing. He's a midfielder whose best actions are often invisible until you slow the clip down. The tiny swivel to escape a press, the half-turn that opens a lane for a fullback, the late arrival into the box that is perfectly small enough to be concealed in a sequence and then explode into a chance. Those are not coachable overnight. They come from repetition, plus an instinctive clock that a few players are born with. He has that clock. Numbers support the eye. Over the past seasons, his minutes have climbed in a way that signals trust rather than casual experiment. The club trusted him, coaches gave him minutes in competitive fixtures, and the data shows gradual improvement in progressive passing, pressing recoveries, and involvement in second-phase attacks. Platforms that crunch per 90 outputs show the kind of steady growth scouts fall in love with. Not spikes, but climbs. Transfer logs and stat sheets show an incremental but steady mileage in minutes and key contributions, the kind of signals that suggest a player's curve is upward, not flat. Tactically, think of him as a lubricant. In a three-man midfield or a double pivot, Kobbie's job is the connective tissue between headlong aggression and methodical tempo control. He's not the hammer or the architect alone. He's the hinge that makes both possible. He reads spaces, he plays angles, and he times his movements to create value for teammates. When he turns in tight spaces, he doesn't gamble on tricks. He chooses angles that make the next pass easier. When he runs into the box, it's rarely for glory. It's for timing, arriving at the moment when a defender's guard is down and the goalkeeper's body is turned the wrong way. It is a mercilessly practical approach to attacking. Not pretty on the surface, devastating in effect. Defensively, he is a first-line thinker. He's not a destructive midfielder, he's preventative. He reads passing lanes and steps to interrupt sequences before they become dangerous. The modern midfielders who are most durable in top leagues are rarely the ones who make highlight tackles. They're the ones who force the opponent into long, low-percentage plays. That's Mainoo's defensive currency. He's the annoyance that grows into a systemic problem because he makes life awkward for distributors. Opposing midfielders get used to one press template, and then find themselves having to make split-second alternatives because Mainoo can invert his position without losing the team's shape. There's also the psychological economy to consider. Manchester United's academy graduates carry more than technical notes. They carry identity. The club's history comes with an implicit promise. The next homegrown engine should be seasoned in the club's DNA. Mainoo went from academy prospect to someone club leadership publicly defended in the transfer window, to a young player that the board and coaches considered too important to flip into a loan just for short-term convenience. That decision speaks to a broader institutional valuation of his profile. He is considered more an asset of continuity than an inventory item. The corporate vote of confidence is subtle but decisive. When a club decides to keep a project rather than flip it for immediate cash, they're betting on long-term architecture. That bet matters to a player's trajectory. And yet, there are friction points. He's not a finished product. The Premier League is a test of physical resilience as much as smarts. Muscle strains have peppered his season, the sort of small injury that, in context, looks like a blip, but in practice can interrupt the rhythm vital to a young player's development. Rhythm is the unsung metric of growth. Consecutive starts, accumulating fatigue, the tiny confidence building that comes from being trusted for full 90 minutes, week after week. Interruptions make that harder. Clubs with meticulous sports science mitigate the damage. Clubs without a consistent plan let those injuries become narrative derailers. For Mainoo, the marginal cost of muscle trouble is higher precisely because his game relies on timing and second-phase arrivals. Every week on the sideline is an ecological cost to his tempo. There's also the managerial fit problem. He rose under coaches who valued positional intelligence, coaches who permitted him to roam the half space, to invert when fullbacks pushed, and to be the on and off switch for tempo. But managers change, tactics shift. He thrived when the structure allowed a creative drift. He flounders if the mandate turns rigid. The danger for many promising midfielders is being converted into the wrong role too early, asked to be the destroyer when they're built to be the balancer, or plugged into a lane where their most valuable runs cannot exist. A transfer or tactical churn could miscast him the way an ill-fitting job miscasts any talented professional. It's not talent that breaks players, it's misapplication. So how do you measure his upside? There are two pathways. The first is organic elevation. The club gives him consistent starts, pairs him with a more physical number 6 to screen when needed, and gives him role clarity. In that scenario, he becomes the midfield connector that teams covet. High pass completion and pressure, progressive passing that increases team XG, and late arrival threat that turns half chances into goals. The second is external opportunity. A mid-sized continental club looking for a young creator offers him consistent minutes in a system tuned to his strengths, and he thrives in an environment where he is the primary tempo setter, rather than the rotational piece. Both roads are viable, both require patience, and both respect the simple fact that midfielders who age into excellence often need time and tactical shelter. Let's examine what the eye and the data say together. He's not topping progressive pass leaderboards, but he's placed in a range that suggests consistent contribution rather than sporadic fireworks. He's got a composure statistic that outpaces peers his age, and his successful press recoveries reflect the kind of incoming intelligence that coaches love, but commentators often miss. The pattern is a player who increases team stability rather than producing flashy moments. That stability is underrated until a team needs it, until the opponent's press intensifies and somebody has to be the calm conduit. Then the understated player becomes the entire game's heartbeat. The market has noticed, which creates another layer. External interest, transfer rumors, and contract discussions generate noise. That noise can be a constructive market signal, a currency of recognition that increases opportunity. But it can also be a hollow heater that distracts. When a young player is suddenly a name in dozens of rumor lists, the simplest protective strategy often comes from the club. Limit change, protect minutes, and be deliberate. Manchester United's decision to retain him in a summer window instead of loaning him out reads as a protective, long-term perspective. That's the kind of shelter a player needs to transition from promising to indispensable. We can also talk about the human psychology behind his on-field calm. There are players who, because they lack early hardship, never develop the specific mental habits needed to shrink when the game gets loud. Mainoo grew in a club culture that forces responsibility onto youth early. That exposure builds a mental muscle of smallness. Not being the loudest, but being the most reliable. The kids who learn to be invisible in their process, to accept that each pass might be unnoticed, but that the team is nevertheless better for it, have an advantage. You can't train humility, but you can create pressure environments where it grows. Mainoo looks like the product of that environment. There's also the meta lesson about how to evaluate young midfielders. Don't fetishize the dribble or the tweetable moment. Look for the pattern of involvement. Count the minutes he changes the tempo on purpose rather than by accident. Watch who he frees with a small movement. That's the difference between players who peak as novelty acts and players who sustain elite seasons. Mainoo's profile says sustainability over spectacle. Imagine the next stage. If he gets a season of uninterrupted starts, paired with a pivot who accepts responsibility for the dirty defensive work, Mainoo's metrics will shift from solid to essential. The team's expected goals will rise in matches where he starts, possession sequences will end more often in high-value areas, and the coaching staff will begin to plan rotations around his presence rather than in spite of it. Metrics will follow. Progressive passes will climb, key passes will become more plentiful, and the narrative will move from promising to indispensable. Those are not guaranteed outcomes, but they are plausible and measurable. Finally, there is a humility to his story that matters. In an era of hyperbole and instant superstardom, Mainoo's pathway is a reminder that the sport is still an apprenticeship. Not every career is an overnight explosion. Some are long, slow compounds where minutes matter more than marketing. So when you watch him next, don't just look for the goal. Look for the half step that turns pressure into space. Watch the moment he chooses to hold the ball when others would panic. Notice how his runs make room for others. Those are the things that don't trend on social feeds, but they win you matches, and eventually they build careers. Kobbie Mainoo is still young, and the best part of his story is that it's unfinished. He's not here to dazzle for a moment, he's here to build an engine. And if football keeps valuing durable, quiet intelligence, he'll be the kind of player clubs pay to keep, not swap.